Well, welcome everyone. My name is Father Charles Sikorsky, and I'm the president of Divine Mercy University. And I'd just like to welcome you and thank you for being with us tonight for this evening's Newman lecture. The St. John Henry Newman Lecture Series has been a project of the Divine Mercy University for over 15 years now, and it features speakers who are widely recognized for their contributions to the fields of psychology, moral and political philosophy, theology, and law. It seeks to promote an international conversation among various disciplines that treat the human person. And I think we're honored and blessed tonight to have with us Dr. David Rosmarin, whose topic will be coping with current events, the role and relevance of spirituality. I first became acquainted with his work a few years ago when I read a fascinating article in the Wall Street Journal that was entitled, "Psychologists Shouldn't Ignore the Soul." In the article, he recounted his experiences as a psychotherapist who wore a yarmulke and how that had brought him into contact with many patients who, somewhat to his surprise initially, I think, patients who wanted to discuss faith and spirituality in their therapy sessions. And this led him to do more research on spirituality and psychotherapy and the great need for within the mental health profession to better address the issue. And eventually he began a center for spirituality and mental health at McLean Hospital in Boston. I've had the privilege over the past almost 2 years to get to know him as DMU has begun working on a research collaboration project with McLean, and you'll hear a little bit more about that later. And it's been great to get to know him as someone who shares a great desire to pursue the integration of science with the soul, and I'm really looking forward to his talk this evening. Before we give him a formal introduction, I'd just like to begin our evening with a prayer. Please join me in the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Heavenly Father, we ask for your grace and presence to be with us tonight as we explore the mystery and nature of the human person and of human life. Help us to see in a deeper way the connection between the human and the spiritual, the soul and the mind, and how that can help us become better people and how we can better the lives of those with whom we come into contact. We ask you to be with us during this time of the pandemic with so much suffering and uncertainty. And we pray for the strength and healing for all who are suffering, for those who've died, and for their loved ones. We also come to at a time when, without a doubt, our country and the world are suffering from division, polarization, mistrust. We ask for your grace to help us all to grow in greater respect for the dignity of each human person and to see all our brothers and sisters as created and loved by you. Help us to grow in mutual respect for each other, our experiences, our points of view, and may we always work in a spirit of charity and with a thirst for what is good, true, and beautiful. We thank you for the opportunity to hear from such a wonderful speaker tonight, and we ask you to bless him with wisdom and insight. Amen. Father. And now I'd like to introduce to you Dr. Suzanne Orter-Hallman, who is Dean Emeritus of the DMU School of Psychology, and she will fill you in on a new the project we'll be working on with McLean, with DMU. And also we'll then introduce our speaker. So I introduce Dr. Orter-Hallman.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to all of our students, faculty, colleagues, and friends. My name is Dr. Suzanne Orter-Hallman, as Father Charles said. I am the President's Liaison for what is known as the DMU, Divine Mercy University McLean Collaboration, and Dean Emeritus of the Institute for the Psychological Sciences. It is my great pleasure this evening to be here with you and to introduce our Newman speaker, Dr. David Rosmarin, and to provide a brief overview of the collaboration between the Harvard-affiliated McLean Hospital and Divine Mercy University. Dr. Rosmarin will speak for approximately 45 minutes, after which we will have an opportunity for questions. We ask that you submit your questions online, and we will attempt to get to as many questions as the time allows after the conclusion of Dr. Rosmarin's lecture. Studies have shown that more than 50% of patients receiving medical or psychological care express a desire to discuss spiritual matters with their healthcare providers. However, traditional psychiatric and psychological training does not often include instruction around spiritual matters. And absent a strong research evidence base, it is unlikely that many providers will adopt a provision for spiritually inflected care. It is in this spirit of mutual recognition of what makes us human and what enables us to thrive in a very complicated and broken world that the McLean-DMU collaboration has taken root. Over the next few years, McLean and DMU will continue to collaborate in the following two main areas. First of all, we will attempt to strengthen the research and philosophical bases for the integration of spirituality in the conceptualization and in the treatment of mental health disorders, inclusive of the specific role of Catholicism. And second, we will aim to train and educate according to two specific theories related to what we in psychology call affect regulation. In the mental health field, we regard the ability to regulate and manage one's emotions as key to well-being. The two theories that we're going to look at more specifically is general psychiatric management, known as GPM, that was pioneered by Dr. John Gunderson and Dr. Lois Troy-Kane at McLean, and dialectic behavior therapy, two of the main staples for the treatment of borderline personality disorder. I will now introduce our Newman speaker, Dr. David Rosmarin. We are so very privileged this evening to hear from Dr. Rosmarin. He is the director of the Spirituality and Mental Health Program at McLean Hospital and an assistant professor of psychology in the Department of Psychiatry at Harvard Medical School. Dr. Rosman also supervises the provision of spiritually integrated services in clinical programs throughout the hospital's divisional structure, where he's been quite the trailblazer and pioneer. He also collaborates with laboratories to study the clinical relevance of spirituality to anxiety, mood, psychotic substances. Dr. Rosmarin is a prolific researcher. He has authored over 50 peer-reviewed scientific publications, numerous editorials and book chapters, and over 100 abstracts, and counting. I especially recommend two of his books, Spirituality, Religion, and Cognitive Behavior Therapy, A Guide for Clinicians, and The Handbook of Spirituality, Religion, and Mental Health, both available on Amazon. Dr. Rosmarin is a frequent media contributor and a wonderful speaker. He has discussed his work on ABC, NPR, Scientific American, Boston Globe, the Wall Street Journal, and the New York Times. What is not perhaps as widely known about David is the fact that he brings to his work an infectious enthusiasm for the project of integrating faith and science. And he does so with humility and a collaborative spirit which encourages dialogue. It is actually, truth be told, one of the few meetings in the month that I look forward to. I will now hand over this very interesting and incredibly relevant subject of the role and relevance of spirituality in our current times to Dr. David Rosmarin. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that gracious, if not embarrassing, introduction. I'm so privileged to be here. I'm going to share my screen because I have some slides. Again, thank you so much for that wonderful introduction, and thank you, Father Charles, for inviting me here. I'm really very honored to address the esteemed faculty and students and friends of Divine Mercy University as part of this Newman's lecture today, the Newman lecture. In early 2019, which seems like an eternity ago, I had the privilege of coming to DMU in person. The primary goal of that meeting was to forge a connection, just to see if we could engender future collaborations. And in that regard, the trip was an amazing success. Here we are 14 months later with very significant tumult in between. And our respective institutions, DMU and McLean Hospital, we've embarked on a very ambitious, I would say, set of collaborations. McLean staff are helping to bolster, as you just heard, Divine Mercy's research endeavors in terms of spirituality and mental health, and I'm looking very much to taking the lead on that. And also, we are helping to bolster DMU's already wonderful clinical training program, particularly in the areas of treating borderline personality disorder and emotion dysregulation. And McLean is benefiting very much from the collaborations. DMU has very fine faculty, its students, and they have a rich spiritual knowledge. And I look forward to our meetings every month as well, Dr. Hallman. But from a personal perspective, something even more important came up from the trip that I took to DMU and from my interactions with the faculty. Over and over again, when I was there, I heard the faculty and the students speaking about what it means to be human. The faculty were passionate about their Catholic Christian meta model of the person. And in essence, this model, from the little I understand of it, postulates that human beings are unique, and we uniquely embody intelligence and the capacity for free will. And we also have a superior capacity for language and cognitive and sensory and emotional experiences. But the reason why we are unique in those regards is because we have dignity and we have self-worth, because we're human. Since we have dignity and self-worth, that generates our capacity for kindness, goodness, and to be spiritual beings. And I hadn't really heard that spoken about too much in my graduate school or undergraduate training. But even more unique was that I left DMU with a palpable sense that the faculty and the staff and even the students, they treat each other with dignity and respect. Regretfully, not all of my university experiences have been the same. So when I came back to Boston, I shared immediately with McLean's president and psychiatrist in chief, Dr. Scott Rausch, that I'd be thrilled to collaborate with DMU and to try to help support the school's growth and in turn benefit from what I had already learned. And that brings us to today's topic. I have some trepidation to approach the subject of coping because I'm not sure I can add much to what you already know, especially the folks who are at DMU already. But as St. John Henry Newman said himself, a man would do nothing if he waited until he could do it so well that no one could find fault. So here we are, and here are some thoughts about how to cope with current events and the role and relevance of spirituality. Throughout the past decade, before current events, Western society has struggled very significantly with mental health concerns. According to the National Institute of Mental Health, nearly 1 in 5 adults countrywide, this is prior to 2020, had an anxiety disorder in every given year. Nearly 1 in 5. And over the lifespan, it's 2 in 5, 40%, actually more than 40%. But the bigger concern than the prevalence is the growing severity of mental health concerns. In the United States, and I know we have an international audience, so please pardon me for being so American-centric, but that's the data I have. 4.5% of adults each year have a serious mental health disorder. Neuropsychiatric disorders are the leading cause of disability in the United States. Nearly 1/5 of all disability cases, people who cannot work because of a disability, nearly 1/5 are from neuropsychiatric disorders. That's even more than cardiovascular disease. Suicide is the second leading cause of death among individuals under age 35, an unbelievable fact. And in fact, more people today die from suicides than cancer, heart disease, stroke, AIDS, chronic lung disease combined in the age 35 and younger. Unbelievable. Also concerning, approximately 20% of college students today, not kids going to counseling centers, but average college students, nearly 20% have engaged in self-injury where they're voluntarily destroying body tissue in order to cope with negative emotions. In other words, prior to current events, on a good day in America, there's an all-out mental health crisis of epic proportions, and it has catastrophic public health and economic results. And then we hit this, which, by the way, it's not 2020 anymore. It's also 2021, as we can see from the last couple of days. 2020 is not over. Technically it is, but not really. The challenges were unbelievable last year. From January, the death of Kobe Bryant, to the stock market crash, to COVID pandemic reaching the entire world. Over the summer, the murder of George Floyd, national riots, an explosion in Beirut, which who knew, at the time, we didn't know if it was an act of war. West Coast wildfires, the death of Ruth Bader Ginsburg, murder hornets, you name it. Then the election, the most difficult election, no matter which side people are on, and the tumult's continuing now with violence in the nation's capital. I think, it's funny, Father Charles, when we were just doing an AV check before tonight's talk, he said, we really timed this one well. Coping with current events. It's a apropos topic. We had planned this months before today, anyway. America's response to this has been to rally. Throughout 2020, the CDC recognized mental health concerns as by taking a very clear stance that these can have just as, if not more, impact on people's health than physical health concerns. There are federally funded bodies, and their sole mission is to advance mental health science, mental health research. There are large professional organizations, the American Psychiatric Association, the American Psychological Association. There are community and consumer-driven organizations like Mental Health America and NAMI, the National Alliance on Mentally Ill. We really are trying. There is, and a lot of this is around Washington specifically, so that there can be an impact on policymakers. So that in of itself is remarkable. But we seem to be losing the war. According to the CDC, during late June 2020, the prevalence of anxiety rose by 50% in America. At the time, not just 1 in 5, but nearly 1 in 3. 31% of the US adult population was suffering from an anxiety disorder in June 2020. More than 1 in 8 adults, furthermore, started or increased their use of illicit substances. And more than 1 in 10 seriously considered suicide in the past 12 months, or 10 months. More importantly, and this is a little bit strange, the likelihood of adverse mental health events, it was not only a function of our life circumstances. Yes, it's been a stressful year, but it's important to know that people who did versus did not know someone who died from COVID, or for someone who tested positive from COVID, or people who were versus were not employed, they were equally likely to suffer from mental health concerns. In fact, if you would think about it, the highest risk group for COVID-19 medical complications is going to be individuals who are older. 65 plus certainly, versus 18 to 24, 25 to 44, or 45 to 64 years of age. But what you see actually is a clear regression line decrease of the incidence of adverse mental health effects over age, such that 15% of those 65 plus had adverse mental health. That was twice as much for people 45 to 64. It was 3 times as much for people 25, and 5 times as much for individuals in the 18 to 24 range. So younger individuals who were comparatively at a lot less risk fared a lot worse in mental health. These trends show a couple of very important things. Firstly, and I think I made this clear on the previous slide, our mental health in the United States, and this is bleeding into other countries as well, of course, is out of control. It is out of control as a nation, and something must be done about it. But second is that the causes of our mental health decline are not only life circumstances. There is something about the way in which we're thinking, the way in which we are behaving that is impacting our mental health states. It's not so simple to say that it's current events, but the way that we are coping with current events, that is having an impact. I'll give you another idea to just bolster this. I was not alive during the Cuban Missile Crisis. It was before my time, 1962 October. But there was a showdown between the Soviet Union and the United States, and it literally brought the globe to the brink of nuclear war. The Soviets built and occupied tens of sites in Cuba, a couple hundred miles from US soil, and they planted nuclear capabilities. They had the ability right there and then to destroy planet Earth. Historians actually agree, from my read of it, that the crisis literally almost destroyed life on Earth. But American life barely changed. Parents went to work, kids went to school, albeit with a couple of accommodations, as you can see from your slide. But there was no discernible impact on the financial markets. The only significant fallout of the Cuban Missile Crisis was US-Cuban relations. Now, in terms of the analogy, I want to be clear, I'm not taking COVID lightly. This is a serious situation. My family has been carefully self-isolating. My kids are still home from school. We're homeschooling this year. And the stressors are real, of course. There's tremendous loss of human life, a real risk of overwhelming the medical system. I myself have struggled in many ways. But as a society, I believe we have to step back and realize we are not handling things very well. I've been asking myself these big questions, therefore. Our baseline anxiety going into current events was through the roof. Why is that? And why have our emotional reactions to the current situation been so extreme relative to previous periods in history when people faced what seem objectively to be bigger concerns, but why are we faring so poorly from a historical perspective? Most important, how can we cope? How can our patients cope during challenging times? So let's start with the last question. What can we do about this? And then we'll circle back, I hope, over to the larger question of why. Why is our baseline anxiety so high, and why are we having such an extreme response? And yes, spirituality has to do with both. So most of the ink in modern psychology of how to cope with challenging life circumstances relates to cognitive, behavioral, and interpersonal approaches. And the good news is that these can help. On the cognitive side, basically the advice is to recognize negative thinking patterns and to keep them in check. To recognize and stop when we catastrophize, when our thoughts are getting away, when they're becoming overly anxious, when we think the worst, to check the facts, to recognize that a certain circumstance isn't necessarily as bad. In the current context of COVID, the majority of the people in the United States have not been infected. Among those who did get infected, the majority have not needed hospital care. Among those who do need hospital care, most did not need life support. And these are just, I'm not saying this is a solution to coping, but this is certainly one piece of it to keep our thoughts in check. A key strategy here, which is a good one, is just to recognize when our minds get carried away, when we're starting to worry. Often this happens at nighttime, and just to call it a night and say, you know what, I'm going to think about this tomorrow after 8 hours of sleep. And that in of itself is one strategy which is often spoken about to manage, to deal with difficult circumstances. That way, even if we do get caught up in worry, at least we're mentally prepared and we're aware of it and we know at least something to what to do. In terms of behavioral strategies, the three most important are sleep, exercise, and diet. This is the holy trinity of self-care. In terms of sleep, this is crucial for stress. Sleep deprivation and irregular patterns are associated with all sorts of maladaptive changes in the HPA axis. It has a cascading effect on the entire central nervous system and has an enormous effect on the way that we feel. In the first days of the pandemic, I collaborated with some folks at Columbia, and we evaluated 300 families in the New York area that were quarantining, the first community to be quarantined. The number one factor of anything that stood out for accounting for people's stress and anxiety responses was quality of sleep. It was more important than having a pre-existing medical condition, being employed, even having kids at home during quarantine. Sleep is key. If I had one piece of behavioral advice for people, set a bedtime and stick to it within an hour. So if you have an 11 p.m. bedtime, go to bed sometime between 10 and 12. Exercise is also key. The Heart Association of America recommends 2.5 hours of exercise. Unfortunately, the American Psychiatric Association does not have guidelines for mental health, but it's at least 2.5 hours a week. So getting out of the house, walking around the block, plus some sort of vigorous, moderate exercise, these are very critical to coping. On the diet front, a lot of people gained weight this past year, but one of the main strategies is not to go more than 4 hours without eating. So people often, what happens in terms of weight gain is they won't eat during the day, and then at nighttime, they'll end up eating much more than their calorie allotment. By eating every 3 to 4 hours, having snacks, combination of carbs, protein, 200 calories, nothing much, that throughout the day can stave off hunger experiences and then make it better later on. Another key behavioral coping strategy is controlling the free flow of information. We are bombarded with electronic media. This could be one of the reasons why we're faring so badly today, although I don't think it's the only reason. But we know everything all the time, and it's just overwhelming. So people need to be aware of the impact of technology and plan accordingly. I typically recommend to all of my patients not to keep their telephone, their cell phones rather, by their bed. Keep it in another room. Plug it in, 10 feet away from the bed. If you use it as an alarm clock, get another alarm clock. We don't need that. Shutting off our devices a half an hour before bedtime and keeping them away is one very critical strategy. Moving on from those cognitive, behavioral, intrapersonal things that we can do ourselves, I'd like to speak about interpersonal coping, and this confers very significant psychosocial benefit. Robert Waldinger, Professor Robert Waldinger here over at Harvard, he has the study of adult development. This is I think an 80 or a 90-year study that's been going on with Harvard College graduates, looking at a host of physical and mental factors over the lifespan and predicting well-being. What Waldinger and colleagues found is that human relationships, the quality of our relationships with other people at age 50 is the #1 predictor of how healthy people are physically, their vitality at age 80, more than mental capacity, financial, material success, or any other aspect of well-being. People who have close relationships throughout their middle age, if you will, age the best. In 2011, there was a fascinating study at UCLA by Naomi Eisenberger and colleagues. Female participants in long-term romantic relationships, they underwent an fMRI, a functional magnetic resonance imaging, and they were receiving these painful, it's part of the experiment, they got these painful electric shocks, either while viewing pictures of their partner or control images of strangers. When these females in long-term romantic relationships looked at their partners, their pain ratings were significantly lower, and so were reductions in pain-related neural activity in the dorsal anterior cingulate cortex, the anterior insula, and other areas of the brain, ventromedial prefrontal cortex. Those neural effects mediated relationships between the quality of the relationship that they had and their experience of pain. In other words, the seeing somebody who we love can reduce our experience of pain through identifiable neural pathways. Really fascinating research. The bottom line is that close relationships, particularly of a romantic nature, they benefit our survival. They're a key factor in reducing our distress. And when it comes to coping, this is one of the things that is really critical. In fact, I think this is one of the reasons why our society is faring so poorly today. Cigna Health Insurance, the major health insurer, in 2018, they did a massive study that more than 3 in 5 Americans today reports being very lonely, the top anchor on a 4-point scale. And among college students, it's actually even worse, which I always find to be ironic considering how social college is. The American College Health Association reported that 2/3 of female and 50% of male college students are very lonely. And not to mention the lifelong probability of marriages ending today is 40 to 50%. So it seems that our relationships with other people, when they are tenuous, sets us up to cope poorly with life circumstances. Between electronics, being bombarded by by information through electronic devices and relationships faring poorly, those are definitely two major factors. Now, all of the approaches we've discussed so far, they are important to know about and they are worthwhile. It's important to change our thoughts to be less catastrophic and to recognize when things are going awry. It's important to adapt our behaviors to make sure that we're getting enough sleep, that we're getting enough exercise, that our diet is regular. It's very critical to connect with others. I think of all those strategies, connecting with others is perhaps the most important. But I would argue that some of the most powerful methods of coping, especially with the current crisis, are born from the world of spirituality. The spiritual domain involves any way of relating to that which is regarded as sacred, sacred being metaphysical or distinct from the physical world. So, Father Charles, you mentioned before the soul, the concept that there is an elevated spiritual element, spiritual part to each human being. That would be the sacred. That would be an example of the sacred. Importantly, for many people, spirituality has a religious flavor to it because it occurs in a religious context which is shared with other people. But spirituality in of itself, it's not necessarily religious because people can perceive that there's a greater reality and it's not necessarily linked to an established religious institution. Statistically, though, the vast majority of people who have a spiritual perspective draw on a religious framework in order to inform that perspective. So it's important, of course, as researchers and clinicians to address religion as well as spirituality. What's really fascinating is how relevant spirituality is, how personally relevant it is to the overwhelming majority of mental health patients, people who come in for services and who come in for clinical services. So I live and work in Eastern Massachusetts. And for those of you who are from out of the country, Eastern Massachusetts is not exactly the most religious enclave in the United States of America. In fact, it's probably the least, certainly one of the least. And here at McLean Hospital, I sampled our patients, and I myself couldn't believe this data, that 60% of our patients have an affiliation with a religious group. 60%, 70% believe in God, 80%, more than 80% pray at least once per week of our patients, and about 2/3 want to discuss spiritual matters with their treatment team. And in fact, more than 80% use spirituality in some way to cope with distress. So what's, I think, fascinating about this is that not only are spiritual methods helpful, as you will see, and I will try to share with you, but they're common even in the least religious areas of the country, if not the world. Spirituality is particularly relevant to mental health today. There's a well-known psychological phenomenon, which is that people tend to gravitate towards spirituality in times of uncertainty and in times of crisis. In June 2020, just this past year, Jeanette Benson from the University of Copenhagen, she analyzed daily data from 95 countries, and she examined Google searches for the word prayer relative to all other Google searches. And what she found was that between March and April 2020, the searches for prayer hit an all-time global historic high. They skyrocketed. And furthermore, those increases occurred in lockstep, stratified by country relative to the number of COVID cases that were identified in each locale. In other words, clear and not even experimental, naturalistic, large-scale global evidence that people tend to gravitate towards spirituality in times of crisis. Along these lines that we were saying that people have gravitated towards spirituality during this time of crisis, spirituality and religion seem to have a particularly important protective effect on mental health today. Actually, Father Charles was the one who shared these findings with me. In December 2020, the Gallup poll here in the United States identified that only 34% of Americans today have excellent mental health. Only 1/3, which speaks to the crisis that I was trying to mention beforehand. Just a year ago, that number was 43%. So it went from 43% to 34%, a 25% decrease. But interestingly, one of the demographic groups that was the least negatively impacted in terms of mental health was individuals who attend religious services at least once per week. Regular church attenders actually saw an increase at the bottom of your slide. You can see it, an increase in mental health in 2020. By contrast, those who don't regularly go to services had a drop between 12 and 13 percentile points. That's equivalent statistically to a 34% decreased likelihood of having excellent mental health. Incredible, incredible data. Why is that? Why is it that people gravitate towards spirituality in times of crisis? And why is it that this can be helpful to them? So these findings, they're not surprising to me. I think they're very stark, but they're not surprising to me because there is a growing scientific literature on spirituality and mental health. And this work remains relatively small if you compare it to the corpus of clinical mental health science. But there are certainly many clear trends that are occurring. Firstly, spirituality and religion are consistently associated with less depression. The effect sizes are not huge, but they are significant clinically and statistically significant, and they do tend to occur fairly much across the board. There have been over 500 quantitative studies on spirituality and depression, and the overwhelming majority are finding inverse relationships, more spirituality associated with less depression. In a couple of very high-profile papers out of Columbia University, kids with depressed parents who are at higher risk have a 90% decreased risk for depression if they report that spirituality or religion are highly important in their lives. In another paper from the same lab, actually following up on those effects, the Columbia group found that the effects of spiritual importance on depression were mediated by increased thickness in the cortex in the left and right parietal and occipital regions of the brain. This is work by Lisa Miller and colleagues. A couple years ago at McLean, we found, not neuroimaging research, but we published a study, in fact, Scott Rausch was involved in this finding that people who have belief in God at the beginning of their treatment, we assessed it at the beginning of treatment, patients who believe in God versus those who do not. Believers in God had greater response to treatment in terms of depression. And in fact, to the extent that they believed in God, they had greater reductions in depression, greater reductions in self-harm, and greater increases in psychological well-being over the courses of treatment. Furthermore, people who had belief in God believed more that their treatment would be helpful to them. They had greater belief in treatment efficacy, that it would help them. And that actually mediated the relationships. So it kind of explains it that people who have greater faith, they have greater faith in spirituality, they have greater faith that they can be helped, and that can get them out of a difficult time. And that's consistent with, I think, the trends that we're seeing in the research that I cited previously. There's another reason why spirituality is relevant to mental health and why people gravitate towards it. Spirituality and religion are associated with substantially less suicide and substantially less substance abuse. There's very consistent evidence on this. In fact, in one recent study in the Journal of the American Medical Association Psychiatry journal, over 90,000 American women were sampled, and weekly service attendance was associated with a 5-fold decrease in completed suicide over the lifespan. 5 times less likely to complete suicide if people go to church regularly, or services, I should say. Regarding substance abuse, a very substantial volume of literature has shown that spirituality and religion protect against incidence and severity of substance abuse, alcohol as well. On average, we're looking at 20% reduced risk, which is very significant. Here at McLean, we're studying these effects a little bit more carefully. This is some research I'm doing with Professor Marissa Silveri, who's in our neurodevelopmental lab. She's a wonderful colleague and somebody who I'm very grateful to collaborate with. And what we are finding so far in our data is that there are many indices of religion that are associated, this is among teenagers, that are associated with lower scores on the balloon analog risk task. For those of you who don't know about the balloon analog risk task, it's a computerized measure of risk-taking and impulsivity. Basically, participants are presented with a balloon and they're offered a chance to earn money by clicking on a tab in order to pump it up. but in each click they earn more money, but there's a greater risk that the balloon will pop, in which case they'll lose all their money. So greater clicks and greater pumps of this balloon, they're considered to be greater risk taking. And people who cash out early, right? People who are like, oh, I made 50 cents, I'm good. That's viewed as a risk aversion. This is related to the suicidality and substance abuse literature, because how impulsive are people? Are they making impulsive decisions like, oh, I'm going to do it? You know, it's a 50-50 shot with each pump that it's going to burst or you're going to get money. That's a risk compared to other risks in other areas of finance. So what we're finding is that religion, these teenagers who tend to be, who have more religion and spirituality in their lives, they tend to be less likely to engage in this behavior. And we don't know over the course of time what the effects are going to be on substance use or suicidality, but it does stand to reason that that this could be an effect or a reason why individuals with spiritual and religious life tend to be less likely to engage in impulsive acts. It is important to note, though, that just as spirituality can be positive, it can also take its toll. And the reason why this is relevant to coping is because sometimes people are using what could otherwise be a very positive way of coping with something, but if it's used in a certain way, that could actually cause more damage. There are, in addition to benefits, again, there are people who struggle with their faith. For example, difficulties like feeling punished by God unjustly, feeling a loss of spiritual meaning in one's life. These are natural, normal, almost healthy parts of spiritual development, because like in all relationships, the spiritual is not going to be positive all the time. This is just, you know, a natural part of life. But when these issues aren't resolved, that's what I mean by unhealthy. When somebody has lingering feelings of unjustness, or that they've lost their spiritual meaning, or they feel disconnected from their faith that they once had. How could this happen? These kinds of questions. Asking the question is one thing, but having it loom over one where it feels like a rock that we're pushing against, literally like the slide. These are problematic, and empirically speaking, negative aspects of spirituality or spiritual struggles, they're less common than positive aspects of spirituality, but when they do occur, the effects are actually quite large. We see them very commonly in our patient populations here, and in fact, in all patient populations, when spirituality is assessed, there are aspects of it that are struggles, and it's very critical to be able to address those, not only to promote the positives, but to be able to validate, to understand where patients are coming from, and to learn how to deal with spiritual struggles. And I've been fortunate to lead some of that work here at McLean, which I'll be happy at some point perhaps to share with DMU. In terms of the research, though, getting back to how this is relevant, this is a study I'm conducting now with 42 geriatric patients, 25 of them being mood disorders and the rest being controls. We were looking at the effects of spiritual struggles, those struggles that people have with their faith, on neural activity at resting state. To provide a little context, resting state neural activity is when a person is put into an fMRI scanner. We're doing a functional magnetic resonance imaging of the brain. And they are lying in the scanner, and there's no specific prompts. They're not engaging in any specific tasks. And when people's activity is higher, when they are just lying there in the scanner, that's usually considered a neural signature of depression and anxiety. And this makes intuitive sense, because if your brain is supposed to be at rest, when your brain should be at rest, it's supposed to be quiet. So if somebody is sitting there in the scanner and they're overthinking, if you will, they're having lots of brain activity, that's usually an indirect indication of worry or rumination or these kinds of things. In any event, spiritual struggles we're finding are associated with substantially greater neural activity in all three resting state modes. And these effects are particularly pronounced among mood disordered patients. So patients who are struggling already with their mood, if they have spiritual struggles, they tend to ruminate, they tend to worry more, and we have some we are seeing some neural effects of that. So these are important points to note. Now, what does all of this mean in terms of coping with current events as mental health clinicians? How can we help our patients to cope? How can we ourselves cope? I'm going to try to put it together here. there are very high base rates of spirituality, especially in patient populations. This domain is clinically relevant in many cases, in positive ways predominantly, but also in negative ways to human health. It can provide hope, it can provide optimism, it can give people faith in the treatment that they're receiving and in many other things, and give people a lift and quell down depression. It can also ground people, protect them from engaging in impulsive acts, providing an orienting framework, give people another filter to think about before engaging in an activity. It's almost like there's a, is this consistent with my values? And that would be another barrier to consider prior to automatically engaging in something. Can also lead to struggles, which we spoke about. For these reasons, as clinicians, one thing that drives me crazy is when clinicians ignore spiritual and religious aspects of life. And unfortunately, psychiatry and psychology have done this for years. I'll speak a bit more about this at the end. But simply having a discussion with patients, and for us, with our friends, family, with mentors, about the perceived relevance of spirituality, about spiritual matters at all, it's an important starting point. In terms of what to actually speak about, I'm going to give you a couple of discussion topics that can be used in order to speak about spirituality with patients, and also things that we can do ourselves, conversations that are well worth having either with ourselves or with our loved ones. The first conversation is about meaning making. Now, meaning making is a spiritual process where it's implicitly spiritual anywhere, where we're trying to understand and make sense of life events. The modern psychiatric origins of meaning making date back to Viktor Frankel, who was an Austrian Jewish neurologist and psychiatrist. He was a Holocaust survivor, in fact, and he observed when he was in the concentration camps that there were these dire conditions, but people could continue to survive and even thrive, as long as one thing happened, as long as they found meaning and purpose in their suffering. When people have the ability to choose, to find meaning, to see that there's a purpose behind what they're doing, when they are choosing to make meaning out of something, that envisioning the future is another aspect of this. When people see that their current suffering will bring them to something greater over time, that could be a catalyst to future growth, then it can have a massive impact. Frankel observed that, in fact, in December in the camps, there were these emaciated prisoners, and they would hold on and survive, but as soon as January came, they would give up because they thought they would be home with their families for the holidays. Once they lost that vision, there was nothing to live for, and they literally died. A couple months ago, McLean Hospital, our own Chris Palmer, so he runs our continuing medical education, does a number of other wonderful things on campus here. He wrote a very popular Psychology Today article on meaning making. In fact, he was based on a quotation from Pope Francis, "Don't waste these difficult days." And he urged us to try to find meaning in the difficulty in the current events, which are difficult. Chris suggested the following, asking ourselves and maybe even our patients the following questions. And they're big questions like, why are we alive? And how do we help other people in our community, in the world? How do we make the world a better place? What are we passionate about? What do we love doing? What are we here to do? What are we built for? Now, one thing that Chris rightfully urged is that this is powerful medicine, because if we don't have an answer to these questions, then getting into the weeds can actually create a spiritual struggle. And it's important, especially in patient care, that if you ask a patient, well, why are you alive? And they're like, well, I don't know. And you don't have a compelling response after that, then the conversation is going to go south. So it's important to be mindful of how this is really potentially very powerful medicine, and anything that can have a positive main effect can also have a negative side effect. This is one conversation that we can have. Another conversation is about acceptance. This is a spiritual concept of radical acceptance. And as I know that McLean is working closely with DMU on I think, Suzanne, you mentioned before, borderline personality disorder, but specifically DBT, dialectical behavior therapy. Radical acceptance is a core concept in dialectical behavior therapy. It's a fairly simple concept, although of course it's a lifelong challenge to put into practice, which is that we have to accept life on life's terms and not resist that which we cannot change. Radical acceptance is about not fighting against reality. And the reason is when we stop fighting against reality, we suffer less. This is a challenge for individuals specifically in the West because we are so obsessed with control. And for anything, we have these predictions for financial markets, political elections, professional sports outcomes, and even though they're almost always wrong, we scrutinize them tens, hundreds of times every day because we prefer to predict the future and be wrong, be dead wrong, than to admit we have no clue what's going to happen next. Acceptance means that we are in less control than we realize, we have less knowledge than we realize. If you think about it from a spiritual perspective, how many people chose when, where, and whether to be born? Anybody on the call? I certainly didn't. We don't choose our parents or economic or social emotional circumstances or the time period in history in which we emerge. I think this is an important spiritual exercise to recognize that we have almost no control over the fate and fortune in our lives. And here are some questions to bring about this. If we're facing a current crisis, what's really the worst case scenario that could happen? What would it be like for that to occur? Could we accept it? What would we do? How would we feel, and who would we turn to? And embracing that, having a sense of the fact that we have to accept reality, it can facilitate psychological preparedness, giving our minds the time, the necessary time to consider bad outcomes, to learn to be resilient, and to move forward. Again, just like meaning making, this is powerful medicine. And if we don't do it right, it can exacerbate symptoms. So I'm sharing it here with a very mature and spiritually sophisticated audience, but please, if you're going to use this with patients, please just be mindful. A final spiritual conversation was not really a final one, but another spiritual conversation. The last one I'll speak about is tolerating uncertainty. Intolerance of uncertainty, the inability to tolerate uncertainty, is known in psychological science as the primary mediating factor in human anxiety. Individuals who cannot stand to know they can't stand to know what's going to happen next. Sorry, they can't stand not knowing what's going to happen next. They tend to be anxious, they tend to be worried, and it really is that simple. This, I believe, is one of the biggest reasons why we are stuck in a mental health crisis today. It's because we cannot accept the fact that life is uncertain. From a spiritual perspective, uncertainty, though, is nothing to be afraid of. I have this thought, well, I haven't been on an airplane it's been a while, since March. It was, March 2020. But every time I'm on a plane, I have the following meditation that I do. I sit down in my chair, and the pilot comes out usually, or at least gets on the radio and says, "Hi, we're flying from Boston to wherever. Thank you for flying Delta, and I want to welcome you. We're going to be flying at an altitude of 35,000 feet. And then the pilot goes in and closes the door, and I sit in my chair. And I have no knowledge of what's going on in that cockpit. I have no control over what's going on in that cockpit. And I am blissfully happy because I don't want to be in that cockpit. I don't want to be in control. I don't want to know what's going on because I'm not a pilot. You don't want me flying your plane, and I don't want to be flying my own plane. And I think that, if you will, spiritual perspective is that it's important to recognize that we don't need to be in control to be in very good hands. From a spiritual vantage point, that's patently obvious. And if this year, when we stopped fighting against uncertainty and embraced it, there are actually these new opportunities that appear on the horizon in medical innovation, in international diplomacy, in education, in finance, in all sorts of different areas. There are opportunities that can occur when we recognize and embrace the fact that we don't need to know what's going to happen next. We don't need to be in control. We can let go a little bit and not only survive, but thrive. Here are a couple of questions, specific discussion questions to facilitate greater tolerance or embracing of uncertainty. Are we ever truly in control? Maybe this much, but there's so many things that we cannot control. Do we ever really know what's going to happen next? What does it feel like to be out of control? Have we ever been pleasantly surprised? Has there ever been a time in the past where things seemed dire, but it actually ended up working out okay in the end? To be very practical, is there any good that could come out of 2020 or 2021? Is there any good that could come out of the current crisis? People aren't asking themselves that question because we're so bent on controlling it and trying to understand what's going to happen next. But if we let go, then there's an opportunity that opens up, which is to embrace the ride and to be okay with it. I want to make a couple of concluding points before we can go into Q&A. We've spoken about conventional approaches to coping. We've spoken about spiritual approaches to coping. Both of these categories have merit. We have to recognize that it's not a matter of either spiritual or secular approaches in coping. It's a matter of which one do I use when. How do I regulate my emotions and understand that right now I need a spiritual approach. Right now I need to get some sleep. I need to work on my diet. I need to be exercising. And other times I need to be actually asking myself the question, David, are you okay not being in control today? Can you really give up like you do when you sit on a plane? But it's important to note that there is not a lot of talk between the spiritual and secular, if you will, approaches. The vast majority of cognitive, behavioral, and interpersonal approaches that are taken in modern psychology have nothing to do with spirituality. They don't relate to any higher order values like meaning making or acceptance or embracing uncertainty or gratitude or humility or integrity or honesty or courage or service, or you name it. They're absent. The CDC and the APA that I mentioned before, they put out several very helpful documents this year with guidelines to prepare mental health professionals and individuals to cope with current crises. Almost every single strategy was non-spiritual. We have to stay informed. We have to correct misinformation. We have to limit our media exposure. We have to practice self-care. If you're having an emergency, call 911. Yes, these are important. But I think we're missing the point because for so many individuals, and sometimes the most powerful coping strategies are born from the world of spirituality. And so many individuals naturally do gravitate towards that. It pains me to no end that the National Institute on Mental Health has yet to fund a single study focused on spirituality. Not a single study has come out of NIMH. And there are a lot of historic reasons for this. Sigmund Freud, his anti-religious views. But to me, it's such a shame because some of the most profound and efficacious, potentially, coping strategies are spiritual in nature. Getting back to the larger question of why are we suffering so much today? I don't think it's an accident that our mental health is worse than ever if you're given this context. In the good old days, it was far more common for people to take a spiritual approach. Far more common. Our culture used to be much more religious. In 2007, about 80% of the US population was Christian. In 2014, it was 70%. If you go back to the 1960s during the Cuban Missile Crisis, it was 95%. Today, 26% of adults are atheists, US adults are atheists. In 1963, it was 2%. 2%, 13 times as much today. It's fascinating to me, again, I'm going to go over this data that we saw earlier. 18 to 24-year-olds are 5 times as likely to have adverse mental events today compared to 65-plus-year-olds, even though they're far less likely to have complications from COVID. They're also more substantially less likely to have spiritual and religious beliefs. And I think that occurs because we haven't been training a younger generation to utilize and to harness spirituality during difficult times. It's almost anathema to the field, but that is changing. And perhaps the reason it's changing is because our nation's mental health is so out of control and there is such a pressing and dire need for this. I really firmly believe that our mental health as a nation could be substantially improved if we were more open, and more frank about spiritual matters. So in sum, there is a small beacon of light, but it's far in the distance. And in the foreground, it's rocky and it's dark and it's hard to navigate to try to find it. But the light is there. And I'm truly excited to collaborate with DMU in the coming years to navigate a path towards that light, to help individuals who wish to use spiritual approaches to deal with mental health. And I'm confident, very confident, that through our combined efforts, we will be able to alleviate much unnecessary suffering in this world. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, David. That was wonderful. We have a number of questions. I hate to say that we will not be able to get through all the questions that people submitted, so I will do my best to collate them. We had some questions along similar themes. One of the topics that came up again and again in the questions we've received this evening is, how do we introduce the idea of spirituality, religiosity within different contexts? How do we introduce it to a patient that we work with? How do we introduce it on a macro level to an organization, a professional organization, or our place of work in a way that can be heard and utilized without getting into the skirmish, as David, you talked about, where there's been this adversarial relationship between faith and science for more than a century?
Great question. How do we get started? Firstly, I love the can-do attitude. Like right away, we're getting practical. So I think that in many ways is a very positive indicator. I'll deal with the second one first, because dealing with patients always occurs in a context. And if the context isn't open to spirituality, then it's very difficult to deal with patients. In fact, I'll just, without waxing too poetic, I remember when I was in graduate school and I was training to learn how to do cognitive behavior therapy. And I was asked point blank on one of my interviews, if you come here for a training, you're not going to speak to our patients about spirituality, are you? I was asked that point blank. And my response was, if that's your approach, then no. If that's your approach, then no, I won't. If that's your rules in your clinic, I'm here to learn about CBT. And I didn't. And there were several patients who wanted to speak to me about their faith, and I didn't. I think it was to their detriment. But there was nothing I could do. I felt I had to get the training that I did, and my hands were tied. And then I wrote that story into my book. So my advisors, they saw it in print many years later, and I think they got the message. In any event, how do you change the system? Research is a very powerful mechanism to do this. I myself have been surprised by a number of findings. I think it's important to be open-minded, also not to go into the process of studying spirituality and religion and mental health with a priori assumptions. I mean, we can base things on an idea or on theory, certainly, and we can have theory-based hypotheses. But it's important to have an open mind and to study this empirically. I studied our patients here at McLean, and I looked at how many of them were spiritual, how many of them wanted to speak about spirituality. And I was shocked to see how many it was. I thought it would be 25%, which in of itself still would have been significant, but it was 2/3 of our patients. It was an amazing, unbelievable number. So I do think that research really turns heads, especially in the realm of mental health. And when we're doing advanced science in order to uncover how spiritual and religious life are relevant to mental health, people start to pay attention. Institutions start to change their policies, and that opens up all sorts of opportunities for us to better service our patients. That's been my approach here, and I think that's probably the best one.
Thank you, David. I completely agree with that. I'm an APA site visitor. Just finished a site visit, and religion and spirituality came up during a site visit at a secular place, and I can say that having compelling scientific data goes a very, very long way in terms of convincing administrators and even clients who may not be all that religious. There's a very compelling argument to be made there. The next question, again, I'm bundling a few questions we've received, I think is so incredibly relevant. It pertains to younger people. So given the peaks and valleys that we know exist in terms of religiosity, we've all lost count of how many parents we've had saying, well, I used to take them to church services, but now they're in college and they're not going anymore. So given the peaks and valleys in religious attendance and awareness of spirituality, have you seen any differences in how adolescents use spirituality in terms of their mental health and coping versus how older adults may use it?
Yeah, it's a great question. From a structural perspective, at McLean Hospital, my research is technically was put within the silo of geriatric psychiatry. And it worked out great because one of my research mentors is Dr. Brent Forrester, who's the head of geriatric psychiatry, and he's amazing. So I'm thrilled to be there. But my data over the first couple studies that we did showed, interestingly, that when it comes to psychiatric patients, we never found that age moderated the relevance of spirituality on people's symptoms. Now, in the general population, I mentioned before, the general population are much less likely to engage in spiritual life based on age. So I think that's true. The proverbial, like you said, I used to take them to church. But when it comes to mental health patients, and especially acute psychiatric patients, and this still needs to be borne out in more outpatient samples, our younger adults at McLean are equally likely to want to have spiritual integrated care. And their spirituality seems to be equally relevant to their mental health as older adults. So interestingly, that I'm still within geriatrics technically, but there's really no reason for that. In fact, I'll tell you a little story. We started out, we have these groups on spirituality and mental health, the spiritual psychotherapy groups that we innovated here and we've piloted. And before COVID, about 3,500 patients per year were receiving these treatments here. And we completed a year-long study on this group, this treatment program at our institution. Initially, one of the eating disorders clinic, which is predominantly 18 to 25-year-old females, well, we approached them and we said, do you want to be part of the study? And they said, well, our patients aren't going to want to have spirituality. So we said, well, why don't you try it and see? And the biggest problem we had was that there wasn't enough room in the area that they put us in to contain all the patients who wanted to participate. It turned out to be one of the most popular groups in that program. So this is why we do research, because you don't know unless you study it.
Thank you, David. That's really interesting to know, because I think a lot of us, those of us who did cover any of this in graduate school, which is very few and far between, usually an elective off to the side if you were lucky enough, what was really emphasized was the lifespan model of religiosity, which had a lot of valleys and some peaks. So this is very encouraging. The next question is, I think, a very current, relevant question related to the closure of churches, synagogues, mosques. So many things have had to close due to the pandemic. Are you aware of any preliminary data? And if there isn't, do you have any hypotheses as to how that lack of structure in attendance and, I suppose, ritual and support, given this modified form, may have been impacting people from a mental health perspective?
Very great question. It's very hard to tell. I'll tell you why it's hard to tell is for two reasons. Number one is because we have this main effect of people being, shut out of churches. But on the other hand, what you have is that certain church leaders, or certain religious leaders, I should say, to be a little more broad, which is accurate, have pivoted, and they have innovated ways to connect with their constituents, specifically around the issues of mental health, coping, family life, supporting people emotionally, not only in an intellectual and in a communal way. historically, I mean, not even historically, we think about functions of religion, people are, they go to a sermon or whatever, they go to some sort of a class, there's a prayer experience, but there's also an intellectual experience, and then there's a communal experience. There's another dimension, though, which is pastoral counseling and the emotional experience. And I've seen, at least anecdotally, several individuals, it was almost bimodal, that several religious leaders who I know have become unbelievable at providing for their congregants' emotional needs. And others are totally incapable of it, and they're kind of falling to the wayside. So in some ways, I see a positive innovation that clergy are actually more, good ones anyway, are more ingrained in the emotional life and family lives of their constituents, of their congregants, which could, I believe, offset some of the negative effects of not having those communal and spiritual and intellectual aspects of religious life. But I don't know. Off the cuff.
That's great. Thank you very much. The next question has a strong academic bent to it. And it is the question as to what is it about spirituality that denotes it as a psychological strength. Sam Harrison argues that any benefits that can be afforded from the spiritual life can also be arrived at by mere rationality. In other words, if the powerful medicine is, first of all, meaning-making, secondly, radical acceptance, and thirdly, embracing uncertainty, are there instances in which people could argue that they're engaging in all of the above in any event and yet not be spiritual per se? And these are the kinds of counter-arguments that I'm sure you're familiar with, David. And so I think the question really relates to, when do we know that spirituality is a psychological strength?
How do we know that the spiritual dimension is intrinsic to the effects?
Yes.
I'm going to be very academic about the response, which is that even if we don't know, I don't think we need to know. This is the way that patients express themselves. This is the phenomenology of our patients. Our patients will come in and speak about God. Father Charles, you mentioned the Wall Street Journal article. I was walking around campus with the yarmulke on my head, and I had patients walking over to me saying, "Can I speak to you about God?" Why does that happen? And doesn't that tell us that we have to actually deal with the patient's perspectives? Like, in terms of what the critical ingredient is, I don't know. I just work here, but I know that my patients want to speak about this. And I know that if I don't categorize things in spiritual and religious terms, I miss out on all this discussion, and I can't innovate methods that are going to help them. And I don't understand them as well. So I don't know if it's a philosophically or theologically compelling argument, but as a clinical scientist, it doesn't really matter, almost. However,
I agree with it.
I think there's a unique synergy when people have spirituality that really, it almost can't be denied. If you just look at the macro level trends, I mean, it's kind of staring us in the face. Can it be, mathematically extracted and proven using a theorem? I don't know. That's beyond my pay grade. I'm not a physicist. But I'm going to study it anyway.
Yes, I think trusting the patient's experience for what it is important. I have a very quick, similar related anecdote. I was spotted going to Mass when I worked at the Catholic University of America many years ago, and I didn't realize that one of the students saw me go in. She came and requested me as her therapist, but she was in a full abaya with a veil. She was from Saudi Arabia. But she came and asked for me because she saw me go into the chapel for Mass. And that was a very synergistic moment in which there was a mutual recognition across, obviously, quite a divide in their actual belief system that really bore out the patient's experience, the thought that I would understand, even if we not on exactly the same plane of, belief system. The next question is also somewhat academic. Do you think that in terms of cognitive behavior therapy, that and I know you've written about this, but the question was, do you think that cognitive behavior therapy is particularly suited to the integration of faith? And if so, could you give us 2 or 3 main highlights as to how that could be?
I'm not sure that cognitive behavior therapy is uniquely suited to the integration of faith more than any other clinical modality. In fact, I mentioned this year-long study that we did evaluating our spiritual psychotherapy treatment across our hospital with there were 1,600 patients in that database, 1,500 patients in that database. And what we actually found was that clinicians who use dialectical behavior therapy, which I guess is a variant of CBT, but clinicians who use the dialectical behavior therapy seem to fare better. Their patients seem to fare better than clinicians who use cognitive behavior therapy or psychodynamic or humanistic models. So I'm not sure that it's uniquely suited to it. However, there's been more ink spilled on spirituality and cognitive behavior therapy relative to other modalities. And I think that's interesting because in terms of psychodynamics, there's been a lot of, I think, tension, a lot more tension because of the writings of Sigmund Freud, the anti-religious writings of Sigmund Freud. In the humanistic traditions, I think they're inherently in some ways devoid of that spiritual realm because it's very based in humanism. But from a CBT perspective, there's this understanding that beliefs, a person's latent beliefs, generate situation-specific thoughts, which affect our emotions. Well, those beliefs can have a spiritual nature to them. And there's also a concept that our behaviors impact how we feel, right? If I'm feeling somewhat depressed, but I get out of bed and I exercise anyway, I'm going to be feeling better by noon than had I stayed in bed all morning. So same thing for engagement in value-driven spiritual activities. So the language, I think, in CBT is more easily permuted to integrate spiritual concepts, but I think the jury's out on whether it's impossible or whether it's, from a clinical effect standpoint, going to have more bang for your buck with CBT relative to others. If anything, probably not.
Wonderful. So we have time for, I think, 1 or 2 more questions. The next one is a slightly more general question, which I think a lot of people have been aware of, peripherally at least. How much do you think this constant 24-hour news cycle, combined with bombardment on social media, is contributing to our stress and anxiety?
It's a great question. It's clearly having some effect. At the same time, the daily news has been around for, I think, 200 years in the United States. People have been aware of all sorts of crises forever, and I don't think it's only our availability of the information, but I think the bigger factor is the behavioral seeking out of that information in order to fill a void. We are taught over and over and over again in our culture that you need to be in control and you need to be in the know. And having access into the information is not as problematic as accepting as the behavior of continually engaging with that information, which I think comes from a lack of perspective, a lack of ability to accept, and a lack of ability to tolerate uncertainty. So to me, I think the root, yes, the proximal cause is access to media and increased media use, but the distal cause, the real root of it, if you will, is, can I deal with not knowing what's going to happen next and not being in control? And to me, that's a very spiritual question.
Thank you, David. The last question that I have from our audience members, which I will summarize, pertains to when we think about spiritual resilience. Are there things that you think stand out in terms of building the stamina from a spiritual perspective to weather life, especially big life events like we've all experienced over the last 8 months? I know one of the things you've mentioned was this idea that you don't get too attached, particularly to, that you're flexible, for example. Are there other things such as, does it matter how orthodox one is in one's belief? how often one attends services, how often one prays. Are you aware of any factors in sort of a factor analysis type of way that would help one build resilience from a spiritual perspective?
A great question. Sort of if you're going to pick a spiritual domain, where in the spiritual domain seems to be the most bang for your buck in terms of accounting for mental health variance? Yeah?
That you said that much better than me. Yes, absolutely.
Okay.
That's it.
So it's a scientific question of how can we account for the largest amount of depression or anxiety or behavioral, addiction, whatever it is, in terms of spiritual and religious factors. It's still early days for this type of research because, like I mentioned before, the NIMH has never funded a single study on the subject ever. There has been some research funded by them, but it's always secondary, tertiary, data. It's never been an actual study funded, So it's kind of embarrassing that spirituality is so common, yet we don't really have a clear answer to this question. But if I had to guess, and I have some data to suggest this, the attachment to God literature is very strong. And attachment research in general is this concept comes from Bowlby, John Bowlby's work, who's a British psychiatrist, who found that people have secure attachment where they feel you're going to take care of me. I know that I'm good in your eyes. I know that you love me. I know that we're you have my back. I can rely on you. Or an insecure attachment, which is either anxious or avoidant. And those same attachment patterns, secure and insecure, anxious, and insecure avoidant, occur with a person's relationship with God. They can feel securely attached, like, you got my back and I'm cool. Or they can feel, are you going to be there for me? Or avoidant, where they actually turn away. Those three attachment styles, when it comes to attachment to God, seem to predict a surprisingly, shouldn't be so surprised by it, but I was at least, a surprisingly high amount of variance when it comes to emotional factors. And this is certainly an area of research that would be fascinating to study further.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Dr. Rosmarin. That concludes our discussion part. I will now defer to Father Charles Sikorsky to end the program this evening.
Thank you, Dr. Hallman, and thank you, Dr. Rosmarin, for just a wonderful presentation. And we're really looking forward to working with you here at DMU. The point that came up a couple times, and you were briefly talking about that at the end, the need for more research in this area, and we're really looking forward to deepen and the amount of research that we do and the different topics that we do, because we're preparing hopefully the next generation of Catholic mental health professionals and others who are interested in our mission. And I think we have to look at it from all different ways, right? Have good clinically prepared people, but also at the same time have that research to back it up so that we can really engage the culture and the world and so many other people in the mental health profession who may be just waiting for more information to really better understand that and integrate that into their work as well, because the need is so great. So thank you very much, and we're really happy that you could be with us tonight. And I just want to, there's a couple of announcements, and thank everyone for joining us and participating. So several have asked a question. We'll send out an email with a recording of the presentation, so that will be coming to you. We will blast that out to everyone who signed up and all those who participated today. So thank you for that. Also, we'll get that in the next few days, I think. They may have to do a little bit of preparation for that, but we'll get that out to you. We also have our next Newman lecture will be coming up in February 18th. Will be Dr. Robert Enright, who is from the University of Wisconsin, and he is an expert on forgiveness in therapy and also forgiveness of communities. And I think it's another relevant topic, right? There's so much work we really love. I think we all have that desire to build bridges in our country, and how can we help heal some of the polarization and so forth that's out there. And Dr. Enright has done work in Northern Ireland and in the Middle East. And, so I think he's got many, many very good things for us to learn about. That'll be on February 18th. And we'll also get you that information for those who want to sign up for that as well. So we also, in the end of January, we have a student symposium coming up. So EMU students will be presenting on different topics. We have we process where we review some of the research our students are doing, and so some of those will be coming. And I believe that part of that will also be virtually presented, and we'll get information to you as well for those who might have interest in learning and seeing some of the research that our students are doing. So thank you all. I really appreciate you for being with us tonight. Thanks again, Dr. Rosmarin, and thank you, Dr. Hallman, for your moderation. It was very, very well done. And God bless you all. We look forward to seeing you again sometime soon.